It's been shocking to see the American government behave this way, right? The ethos of American society embraces free speech. It's almost the American civic religion, and to see the government use public health as an excuse to violate free speech rights, and the irony, though, Anders, is that what were we saying? Like, what kinds of arguments were we saying? We were saying that we should have focused protection of older people. We should have that lockdowns are harmful to young people. I mean, those were true things to say. That means that the stakes are much higher than normal free speech cases. I mean, normal free speech cases, our stakes are high enough, right? We should, whether we have this ability to speak freely our minds is quite important. But here you also have public health at stake. If outside critics cannot say true things criticizing public health, well, I think that means that the health of the public is harmed. You could make a case, Anders, that the censorship actually led to more deaths than almost any other single policy.
Hi everyone, this is Mind the Shift, and I am Anders. I know that most of you just want to forget all about this, the weird and gloomy pandemic years. But I'm pretty sure that you want to hear what my guest today has to say about it. I'm glad and honored to welcome Professor Jay Bhattacharya. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you for having me.
Just to give a brief background for those in the audience who don't know much about you and what you do, Jay is a professor at Stanford University and a leading expert on health policy. I think you're a professor of economics as well as health policy. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting and useful combination, I guess, if you want to.
Turned out to be useful.
It turns out to be useful when you want to understand how society can work well. So, and he rose to fame, if that is what you should call it, when he voiced criticism against the lockdown policies in the USA and elsewhere. And he's one of the three initiators of the so-called Great Barrington Declaration of October 2020, which promoted what was called focused protection instead of sweeping lockdowns. And we will come back to that, of course, talk more about the GBD, as you sometimes can call it. And by the way, we have had the two other signatories, the two other initiators of the Great Barrington Declaration here on the show, Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff. So you're number three, the full team. Well, it turned out then that the establishment did not like dissenting voices like your voices in the Great Barrington Declaration. So, Jay, to start with a very sweeping question here, how has your life changed after all the brouhaha around the GBD and the subsequent ostracizing, really, of you by the mainstream?
Well, it's fundamentally transformed. I mean, before the pandemic, I was a quiet scientist. I published papers and really enjoyed my life. Mostly I would fight with referees, and then that, if my papers might get published or not, and that was fun. I never was on TV before. During the pandemic, I've had to take a very public role, and in some ways been very gratifying. I've met many fantastically interesting people, had an opportunity to participate at the front row of a lot of important health policy decisions. But at the same time, it's been traumatic as far as my personal life. Many friendships have been broken. At Stanford, where I work, at one point during the pandemic in 2021, 100 of my colleagues circulated a secret petition to try to get the president of the university to silence me. So it's been I've had lots and lots of opportunities to practice how to forgive other people. So
that's a wonderful way of seeing it, actually. But it must have been terrible.
I mean, I think things are starting to come back. People with whom my relationships were broken are starting to reach out to me, which is gratifying. There are many people I don't think I will ever be able to work with again. People I worked with before the pandemic. I mean, it just makes me sad. But on the other hand, there's a lot of I wouldn't be talking to you, Anders, if I hadn't spoken up. So there's that.
There's that also, which is a good thing. And I mean, you're one of the few who actually have had the courage to speak up, because I think that there are many, many more colleagues of yours, I mean, around the world, health colleagues and doctors who actually have agreed with you all along, but haven't dared to speak up. Would you agree with that?
I do. So when we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, I was under the impression that we were a minority. That in fact there were only a few people that really were against the lockdowns in medicine and top medical schools and so on. What I've learned since then is that I don't think we actually ever were truly in the minority. That truly there was always a considerable opposition to the lockdown policies, even in 2020. And the evidence of that is that, after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, tens of thousands of doctors and epidemiologists and other health policy folks signed on immediately.
Mm. I think the number of signatories now is almost 1 million.
Yeah, I mean that includes regular people, but like credentialed people with MDs and so on. 50,000, within days signed on. The counterattack on it, I think, the primary purpose wasn't actually to discredit the ideas in it. The primary purpose of the counterattack was to discourage other people who agreed with it from voicing their opinion, to cause people to self-censor.
Mm. Do you think that the people who are now reaching out to you again or wanting to be friends with you again, is that because they have realized that you were right all along, or that they just want to forget about all these, the bad things that happen and just want to go on with the life?
It's a mix. I mean, I've had people who reached out and said that they were, felt some regret over the strong positions that they took during the pandemic. And others just, I like having friends, and if they don't want to talk about it, I'm happy to not talk about it. It's okay. I think so. It's definitely a mix.
Yeah. There are some other topics you can talk about when you meet have a barbecue or something.
There's more to life than the pandemic.
Right. So now the most topical thing right now, the most recent development in the Bhattacharya saga is a lawsuit against the American government. It has the title Missouri v. Biden, Missouri versus Biden. And the plaintiffs, which are you and others, including Martin Kulldorff, claim that the government has violated the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is about freedom of speech. And now this is really intriguing. So can you just give us a brief explanation here? In what way has the government violated the First Amendment?
So just a very quick background, the lawsuit was actually originally brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices. So these are states in the United States, and they're suing the federal government, Biden administration, for violating free speech. The evidence of this that we've uncovered is remarkable. There are emails and evidence of direct communication from the White House to social media companies, directing to social media companies to telling them ideas to censor and people to censor. And these are not, national security threat ideas. They're ideas like the Great Barrington Declaration, right? They're the United States government, a dozen federal agencies, including, by the way, we in this lawsuit we deposed Tony Fauci and a number of other White House officials. The United States government, a dozen federal agencies, have what I would call a vast censorship network. You could call it a ministry of truth. I sometimes jokingly call it that.
From 1984, the book by Orwell.
Yeah, I think that what they wanted to do is use the power of the federal government to make sure that the conversations in online settings, in places like Twitter, Facebook, and so on, corresponded to their preferred narratives. There are emails that say even if they were true facts that were inconvenient, for instance, on whether the vaccine stopped transmission, they wanted to suppress that discussion because it didn't correspond to government goals, for instance, in the vaccination campaign.
But that's not what they said, right? I mean, they didn't say that this is goes against our policy, so we have to suppress it. They called it something else. They called it, what did they call these?
Yeah, they called it dangerous misinformation, right? So
Yeah.
the justification that the government used to set up this censorship network was that there were private actors in social media that were spreading ideas that were so dangerous to the public that it was legitimate use of state power to stop the spread of those ideas.
Mm. Well, it sounds a bit like Ministry of Truth, as you say, actually. But and how did it play out? How did they go about doing this? You talked about emails here? Were there phone calls? Were there direct were they trying to force people to stop doing these, to stop posting things that they didn't like on social media and things like that? Or in what way did this happen?
Primarily, they use the companies themselves rather than going after the people. So, for instance, the evidence we've uncovered suggests that they had people that were that had access to the databases of these companies, so they could search for posts they didn't like. They would threaten the companies. So, in the United States, there's a law called the Communications Decency Act, passed in the mid-90s. And there's a section of that law called Section 230. And what that law says is that a social media company isn't subject to lawsuits for libel or whatnot, or slander, because they need to be places where they'll allow people to publish whatever their thoughts are without saying, like, let's say I published a lie about somebody, a harmful lie about somebody on Twitter. Well, then Twitter should not be liable for that lie because even though they published it. Now, normally a publisher would be responsible for lies.
Mm.
And under Section 230, Twitter is not responsible; it's not considered a publisher. The reason why that law exists is because Twitter needs to be a place where people can just have free speech. Right? If Twitter was worried about being sued for libel for every single post that it allows, then there wouldn't be any free speech.
Well, it would be like suing, U.S. mail for delivering, letters, physical letters that it contains, slander and things like that. So
yeah, so I mean, I think it's a good idea. The deal is that the social media companies then cannot turn around and have editorial policies that look like a publisher, right? They can't systematically exclude large chunks of speech just because they don't like it. Now they can, within the Communications Decency Act, exclude speech that actually is a direct physical threat to other people or violates the law. That's legitimate. And I completely agree with that social media companies ought to be able to restrict that kind of speech. But there's a wide range of speech that social media companies should allow with absolutely no restrictions. Now, if you look at the emails, that we uncovered in Missouri versus Biden, you'd see the White House officials directly threatening regulatory action surrounding Section 230 if they didn't comply with the censorship demands. And so, the social media companies would have these people that would be in charge of government relations, trying to like make the government happy, often by censoring speech.
So you have evidence that the U.S. government coerced these companies, these tech companies, to censor users.
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly what we found. And if I can maybe I'll send you the link afterwards, but we have 300 pages of findings of fact or proposed findings of fact that we put into the court that documents this vast enterprise. And we it's based on countless emails in the discovery that we did from the lawsuit, as well as depositions of prominent government actors, including as I said, Tony Fauci, people in the sort of the
President
general
himself
public.
and Mayorkas and the health secretary. As,
So we didn't actually depose Mayorkas, but there are people in like at the FBI and inside HHS. So the judge basically told us who we were allowed to depose, and there's a very very high standard to depose someone such a high level. So it was a big coup to be able to depose Tony Fauci. But in many of the other offices, we would get someone just one level down that we depose. But in any case, we have access to all of the relevant emails and communication between the federal government and these social media companies.
You mentioned Twitter a lot. I know you've been very active on Twitter and still are, but this goes for the other social media platforms as well, I assume? Facebook, LinkedIn?
Reddit, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very broad-based effort because the government viewed the speech as some sort of public health threat, and they used their power to try to suppress it.
When did this start? It was before Biden's administration, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think there even before the Biden administration, there was this infrastructure in place, but during the Biden administration, it ramped up into an almost unbelievable degree. I mean, I think certainly inconsistent with the American First Amendment, the very least inconsistent with the idea that free governments should not be restricting the speech of free people.
Yeah, yeah. I spoke to Janine Eunice, whom you know, and who has been. She's not part of the case anymore, but she through an organization called NCLA, she's been legal advisor, or what's the term?
Yeah, so she was my lawyer.
Okay.
The NCLA represented me and Martin in the case. So it's a little bit complicated, legally, but basically the lawsuit was brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices. There were private parties to the suit that were affected directly or potentially directly by this, including me and Martin. And we were represented by the New Civil Liberties Alliance. And now what's happening is that we're trying to create a class of people that were affected by this. A class would be people not directly in as parties to the lawsuit, but that were affected by the censorship efforts of the government. So this has become a sort of a much more suit, yeah. But I think the key thing to me, I mean, the outcome of this suit for me, it won't be money. That's not what I want. What I want is some sort of restrictions on the federal government's capacity to do these kinds of activities. The court needs to oversee the activities of the federal government in restricting American free speech. That really needs to be the outcome. I think even just publicizing the fact that the American government behaved in this way is a big victory. I think. I mean, the people should know that the American government is acting in this way. It's completely contrary to the basic rights of American citizens. And exposing it, I think, is already a big victory of this lawsuit.
Janine Eunice told me when I spoke to her that she's convinced that this is the worst violation of the First Amendment that the United States has ever experienced.
I mean, I think this is the most important First Amendment case since at least the Pentagon Papers case in the 70s, which had to do with press rights. I mean, you could go back in Americans, maybe the Alien and Sedition Acts and I don't know. You'd have to go back pretty far to find such a direct violation of First Amendment rights.
So your hopes are not to get any money or anything, but to make a case here to have precedent, so to speak, for the future. But what are the prospects? What do you see before you here? By the way, what's happening right now with the lawsuit? Where is it?
So I think the prospects are quite good that we're going to win this case. So right now it's at the federal district court, and it's in front of a judge who there was the government put forward a motion to dismiss the case, usually cases like this fail at the motion to dismiss. The judge responded with a 77-page or 80-page document, essentially rejecting almost every aspect of or every part of the theory of the government's case, responding to us. And so we survived the motion to dismiss, and now what's happening is there's going to be, I think, a ruling on the preliminary of whether there will be a preliminary injunction on the federal government in the next month or two. I think. I mean, it's hard to predict. I mean, it depends on the judge,
but you would say that the prospects are pretty good that that you're going to win this at some point.
Yeah, I think we'll get a preliminary injunction from this judge, and then the government will have to decide what to do. It can dismantle the censorship industrial complex if it wants, or it can try to send the case to the Supreme Court. So I'm getting a little bit of ahead. I mean, but if you read the 77-page ruling by the judge against the government's motion to dismiss, I mean, it basically adopts the theory of the case that the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney Generals have put forward, that there was a vast censorship enterprise. So I do think it's likely we'll win at the district court level. Then it remains to see what the government does. I mean, I hope what the government does is it responds to the ruling and then just dismantles the censorship industrial complex, puts in place constraints so that it never happens again. That's what I hope happens. I suspect what will happen, though, the government may want to move the case to the Supreme Court and see. But even there, the Supreme Court has been quite friendly to First Amendment rights in the last few years. So I don't see that the government has much prospects of winning this case. But I shouldn't get ahead of myself. I'm very bad at forecasting what courts will do. So take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, but it sounds big anyway. I mean, if you win here, or shall we say when you win, it's going to be huge, I think. I mean, ramifications, global ramifications, really, or how governments can act. And I mean, the US is a beacon for many countries. So
it's been shocking to see the American government behave this way, right? The ethos of American society embraces free speech. It's almost the American civic religion. And to see the government use public health as an excuse to violate free speech rights, and the irony, though, Anders, is that what were we saying? Like, what kinds of arguments were we saying? We were saying that we should have focused protection of older people. We should have that lockdowns are harmful to young people. I mean, those were true things to say. Those were not false.
I mean, that's the shocking thing, because we haven't even talked about the contents of this, because as you say, I mean, even if you told lies, you should still be able to do that on a platform like that. I mean, the government shouldn't censor you anyway, but these were actually truths.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that what that means is that the stakes are much higher than normal free speech cases. I mean, normal free speech cases stakes are high enough, right? We should, whether we have this ability to speak freely our minds is quite important. But here you also have public health at stake. If outside critics cannot say true things criticizing public health, well, I think that means that the health of the public is harmed. I mean, you could make a case, Anders, that the censorship actually led to more deaths than almost any other single policy. The reasoning being that the censorship activities allowed the government and public health agencies to continue in error long after they would have corrected themselves, and those errors were consequential, leading to harm to the health of the public that would not otherwise have occurred.
Oh, that's heavy. But I think you might be right, actually. I mean, from my point of view, let's see what the judges think and what other people think when this case continues. Now, you you have mentioned Twitter a lot here because you're active there, and things have happened with Twitter, as we all know. Elon Musk took over, and after he took over, he released what has been labeled the Twitter files. And at one point, you were summoned to the Twitter headquarters because you were getting some information about what had happened to your account, which is kind of interesting. I heard you talk about this on the Unheard program, which was a great interview there. And so, what did you learn when you visited the Twitter headquarters about your account and what had happened?
So the Twitter files. Barry Weiss of the Free Press, she wrote a story, and what she found was that I'd been put on a Twitter blacklist. So what is a Twitter blacklist? Essentially, I can post, as far as I can tell, there's nothing wrong. My followers can see my posts, but other people who are not my followers have no chance of seeing my post, even if the post goes viral, or it essentially suppresses the reach of my post.
Okay, but normally it would spread because of the algorithm that looks for things
Yeah,
that go viral.
right. It basically put a thumb on my post, so that, and from as far as I could tell, I was doing fine. Like my followers would respond to my post, and I would get likes and things. But that wasn't the purpose of my joining Twitter. The purpose of my joining Twitter was to reach people who hadn't heard my message before. And the purpose of joining Twitter for me was essentially the GBD. I mean, my very first post was the Great Barrington Declaration, or I think like the second post was the Great Barrington Declaration. And I wanted to tell lots and lots of people about the GBD and about my pandemic views. That's the only reason to join Twitter for me. So when I learned about the Trends Blacklist from Barry Weiss, it was really a shock. Like, I thought that I was doing something useful with Twitter, and it wasn't useful. It's just, I mean, guaranteed they're trying to suppress the reach of my ideas for no purpose.
Yeah. You were swimming in a small pond, and the rest of the sea was unaware what you were doing.
Yeah. So I got when after that happened, there was a lot of press attention, and through various channels, Elon Musk invited me to drive up to Twitter headquarters in San Francisco. And I met with a Twitter engineer, and I learned that I was put on the Trends Blacklist the very day I joined Twitter. So, I mean, and what did I post that day? I posted a link to the Great Barrington Declaration. Question is, why? How could I be? What did I do that first day that led to Twitter putting me on a Trends Blacklist? I mean, I don't have a direct evidence of or an answer to that question based on what I saw at Twitter. But my hypothesis is that it's the government censorship industrial complex used its power to try to get to put me on that Trends Blacklist. Right?
So you didn't see any evidence at the Twitter headquarters that there had
No,
been
I mean,
concerning you specifically?
No, I did. I saw evidence about Twitter's decision making regarding the Trends Blacklist about me. What I didn't see was what induced Twitter to make those decisions. And that I think there are databases at Twitter, Slack channels and things I didn't have access to that day, but that some of the reporters that are reporting on the Twitter files do have access to. So maybe more information will come out. But what I saw that day was the decision to put me on the Trends Blacklist happened the day I joined Twitter. That I didn't know before from the reporting. I also saw that Martin Kulldorff had been put on a Trends Blacklist at various times also.
He was banned from LinkedIn, I think, at some point.
Yeah, well, his posts were banned from LinkedIn. I mean, he was also banned from Twitter at one point, right? Because he posted, I think it was a post saying that that masks have harms. Then he got banned again for another post saying that it's not rational to treat everybody the same regarding vaccines. You should treat potentially older people differently than younger people, which is actually now, I think, basically Scandinavian policy.
Really reasonable, yeah.
Yeah, and that for that he was banned. I mean, I think it was funny. Like, before the Missouri versus Biden case, I thought that it was these social media companies themselves that were the bad actors. Now, the way I view this, they were responding to the pressure from the federal government. Now, some of them may also be by themselves unable to read evidence, but that while that's problematic, it's not such a bad thing. There's lots of social media companies, and potentially you could use the fact that basically every single prominent one of them behaved in this way. I think can only be explained by this coercive government force.
Yeah, it makes sense when you think about it. Yeah. Because why would they? I mean, they want followers, they want users, they want accounts, they want to make money. So why would they censor on such a broad scale?
It doesn't make any sense, right? The only reason they do is because government. Now, we have access to the federal government's activities, but Anders, I'm pretty sure that many other Western governments behave the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting to see what's going to happen after this case if you win or when you win. Other countries, I mean, I know there are quite a few lawsuits in the pipeline actually in other countries as well, in France and Germany and United Kingdom, about not specifically perhaps about censorship, but about how this whole thing was handled in different aspects of it. So it's a lot of legal action going on.
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful that at least some of it will come through. I mean, I think, as I said, I think the main thing is not so much winning or losing the case; that it's exposing it and then telling the public about it. Because I think if the public understands what happened, the governments that did this won't survive. Like they'll because they violated basic liberties of people, and as a result, bad policies were adopted in public health settings that very likely cause people to die. I mean that is a serious thing, and I think we still live in democracies. I think these will have political consequences.
Yeah, hopefully we'll linger in the collective consciousness for at least a couple of decades
Yeah.
until maybe people forget. I don't know. We shouldn't go that far into the future, but at what point did you realize that something wasn't quite right with your Twitter account? You said that you felt that you were doing fine, but it was a bit strange, wasn't it, that so few people actually reacted to this big declaration that you had posted there and all that?
I mean, I never had any experience with Twitter before 2021. I mean, I told all my graduate students not to join Twitter because, just publishing papers was the more effective way to change the world, I thought. So I didn't really have a sense of what to expect as far as, and it looked to me like I was having some pretty good engagement. Like, I had almost 100,000, 150,000 followers, in the course of a year of being on Twitter, which felt like success to me. I mean, I thought that's a lot of people, I thought. But you can get a sense of this of how the suppression works, because after the Twitter blacklist was lifted, I now have almost 440,000 followers. I mean, a very large number, very very sharp increase in the number of followers. I wondered how many followers I would have had in 2021 if the blacklist hadn't been in place.
Yeah. Scary, fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about the cause of all this. One of the causes, at least the big cause focal point here, the GBD, the Great Barrington Declaration. If you just it was published early October 2020 in a place in Massachusetts called Great Barrington. That's hence the name. So can you just give a brief summary of what it contains? I think it's better that you do it than me. I know a bit about it, but you know it
Well,
better.
you've already talked with the Martin and Sinetra, so I mean, let me just briefly summarize the scientific basis for it and then the recommendation. It's very very easy to see what the science is behind it. The first fact is that there's a very steep age gradient in the risk of dying if you have COVID. Right, it's older people that die at very much higher rates than younger people. In fact, for children, it's vanishingly low of dying, and not just dying, but also hospitalizations and the severe outcomes are much more likely for older people than younger people. The second scientific fact is that lockdowns are harmful. That many of the restrictions we imposed on people's lives were harmful to the health of these people, and that's just, I think both are indisputable facts. Like, I don't think there's anybody that denies either fact. So if you combine those two facts together, you get the Great Barrington Declaration, which is focused protection of older people. That is, provide resources, ideas, so that older people can, in times of high disease spread, protect themselves. And then lift lockdowns, stop disrupting the lives of young people, especially children, because the harms you do to them greatly are much greater than whatever punitive benefit they would get in terms of reducing the risk of COVID.
Now, we know quite a few things now that we didn't know then about the virus, for instance, and about the vaccines and how they would work and all that. But I guess the basics of the declaration still hold water. But let's just to act as a devil's advocate here a little bit. the Queen's University in Canada, in Kingston, Canada, they just a couple of weeks after you published the declaration, they posted an article where they listed 5, as they called it, failings of the declaration. So let's see. I just briefly say them here, read them here, and see what you have to say today about what they then thought were failings in this declaration. Number 1, it creates a false dichotomy. The declaration rhetoric offers a false choice between a wholesale return to our pre-pandemic lives, which is objectively dangerous, versus a total lockdown, which no one advocates.
Okay, so both of those elements in that statement are incorrect. So first of all, the declaration did not call for a wholesale return to life. What it called for is focused protection of vulnerable people. We wanted to take the disease really seriously, and that means that you take the epidemiology of who's at risk seriously. We were wasting a very large amount of effort restricting the lives of young people, children, closing schools, and so on. With very little benefit. And then we were also neglecting to protect older people. 40% of the deaths in the United States in 2020 and 2021 were in nursing homes. We did not adequately protect older people in nursing homes. In fact, many states, they sent COVID-infected patients back to nursing homes. Imagine if they had embraced the principles of the declaration, you couldn't imagine doing that, because older people are at high risk. So it's not true that we were calling for a return to normal life without any change, that we were calling for focused protection. The second part of that statement is also incorrect, that nobody was calling for a severe lockdown. In fact, if you look around the world, China was. Australia adopted a draconian lockdowns, massive civil liberties violations. And Canada also had what I would call a pretty severe lockdown policies, including at some point where unvaccinated people were not even allowed to travel within the country. You could see like a lot of the reactions were along these lines, trying to diminish the idea that there could be a lockdown. Well, in October of 2020, it was really clear to us there was going to be another lockdown, and there was. Like the UK adopted one where people weren't allowed to leave their house for more than an hour a day or 2 hours a day or something. These were dramatic policies put in place with a promise to protect us from COVID, and so that criticism was wrong on both fronts.
Yeah. Okay. So number 2 here is a little bit ridiculous, perhaps, but I'll read it anyway. The Barrington Declaration gives oxygen to fringe groups.
I'm guilty. I'm a fringe epidemiologist.
I know, yeah, according to Fauci and others.
Yeah, I think the irony is that the fringe turned out to be correct. Fringe ideas that like those that Anders Tegnell in Sweden turned out to be the right ones.
Well, I guess that's how humanity evolves, isn't it? The people who everybody thinks is crazy in the beginning, when it turns out that they're right, then things change and we can evolve. So,
the funny thing is, Andres, about that is that the GPD is actually the least original thing I've ever written in my life. Yeah. There's nothing new in it. It's the old pandemic plan. It's how we manage the century of respiratory virus pandemics. Successfully, I might add. The idea is identify who's most vulnerable, develop countermeasures like vaccines and treatments as rapidly as you can, and engage in focused protection of those vulnerable people. Don't disrupt the rest of society, because disrupting society causes more harm than good. That was the old pandemic plan.
And so you were actually the mainstream, and the government was the fringe in that respect.
Yep. Yeah. So again, I was joking about it. I was guilty, but that criticism has exactly backwards.
Interesting. And number 3 is the Barrington Declaration puts individual preference far above public good, and then they make some comparisons with traffic rules. Imagine if everybody should follow traffic rules on an individual basis. You get the point.
Okay. So two responses. One is, that by itself is not really a reason to do or not do something. If the individual good serves the collective good, then fine. But the irony here is that, in fact, The Great Barrington Declaration was calling for collective action, not individual action. It's the lockdowns that were actually individualistic in nature. So, like, let me give you a sense of this. So, like the lockdowns, not everybody in society has equal capacity to comply with the lockdowns, because societies are tremendously unequal. If you look at what actually happened, a relatively small class of people, I call them the laptop class, who could not lose their jobs as a consequence of the lockdown. They could work from home safely. They offloaded the risk of the virus to other people who served them. Right? Someone had to grow the food. Someone had to deliver the food to the home. Someone had to make sure the electricity was running. Someone had to make sure the hospitals were going. All of that was essentially a whole class of people working to protect a small group of people who could work from home. That's
with the lockdown policy made it. With the lockdown policies, the working class had to bear the brunt of the risk of the virus, right?
Exactly. The working class was required to bear the brunt of the risk of the virus. It's really well put. And to call that individualistic, I think, is a perversion of the term.
Yeah. And number 4 says that the declaration misunderstands herd immunity.
Okay, so the funny thing about this is that if you look at the nature of the criticisms of this, there's two overlapping things that people get wrong. First, and you can see this, there was a memorandum that was put out called the John Snow Memorandum shortly after the Great Barrington Declaration response, arguing on the premise that we didn't even know that if you were infected, that you would produce immunity at all. Now, in October of 2020, this was scientifically untenable. It was abundantly clear that reinfection rates were very, very low. If you'd had the set of people who'd been infected early on were protected relative to the rest of the population in terms of reinfection. And there were a number of important papers in places like Cell and Nature that documented the mechanisms by which immunity happened. For instance, the activation of specific T cell responses so that you could remember how to deal with the virus the second time you saw it. So by October 2020, it was clear that if you had COVID and recovered, you had pretty good immunity. Now, we didn't know it was perfect immunity. Like, for instance, with the other coronaviruses, you can get reinfected, but it lasts a while, 2-3 years at least. Or sometimes but now if there's a variant, of course, you can escape the immunity. You can get reinfected, but the variants in the other coronaviruses, and it turns out for this one as well, don't evade the protection immunity provides against severe disease. So if you'd had COVID once and recovered, the second time you got it was likely that you would have less severe illness than the first time you got it. Now, there's exceptions to this. These are not like ironclad, but these are rules that are really important to know. So the first point then is that COVID infection produces immunity. That's true. We knew that in October 2020.
And we knew that in October, yeah, right.
Or else I wouldn't have signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration. The second thing is herd immunity. Now, herd immunity is complicated in the context of this disease, and I'm sure Sunatra told you all about it because she is one of the world's experts, leading theoretical epidemiologist. But the basic idea of herd immunity is so simple and obvious that I can't believe that any reasonable scientist would write or sign their name to a statement like the one that you just read from that Queen's College people. So the idea of herd immunity is that if let's say you have an immune naive population and people randomly run into each other, right? One person then will spread the disease to all the people that they run into, and there's no immunity, so they might spread it to 10 people or 4 people or whatever number of people, right? So but suppose that half the population is immune, so that a random interaction doesn't produce a transmission event. Well, then they won't spread it to 10 people. They'll only spread it to 5 because half the people they run into it's not effective. That's herd immunity. That's the basic idea of herd immunity. The way it works itself out is more complicated because the probability of a transmission might be higher in the winter, for instance, than in the summer, right? So the herd immunity threshold can change from based on seasonality. The number of people that are immune may decline over time because there's waning immunity. So the key point is that herd immunity exists. It's a little more complicated with coronaviruses, but it's a really important phenomenon. It's what controls. It's why the disease isn't always spreading all the time. What leads to reductions in the number of cases locally, and the idea that herd immunity doesn't exist in coronavirus is just flatly wrong. You can see it, right? Why is it that the disease seems much more indolent now? A large part of that is that a very large fraction of the population has seen the disease before and recovered, and also, of course, the vaccines, right? Those two together are why it's not March of 2020 anymore.
Yeah, and then, but at that time, back in the summer and late and fall of 2020, there were quite a few calculations swirling around which were wrong on both ends. I mean, there were some that were actually exaggerating the risk, and there were some that were doing the opposite. So, I mean, there was a lot of data.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, like, these models are like, they're useful tools for thinking conceptually about how to manage the pandemic. But I think that, like, a lot of times these models, people take them literally as if they're like weather forecasts.
Yeah.
And I think that was the problem. Like, depending on what assumptions you put in, the technical assumptions can have a very, very big effect on the predictions of the model.
It's exactly like the climate discussion, which we won't go into here, but I've been into that many times. So number 5 is says that the declaration offers no details on how it would protect the vulnerable. Did you provide details?
Yeah, that's false. So if you look on the website, we had a frequently asked questions that we posted just shortly after the declaration. And in the declaration itself, I think there's like 20 specific suggestions for how to protect older people. But I should say that our idea wasn't that we, the three of us, somehow have a monopoly of knowledge on how best to do protection of elderly people around the world. What we were asking for was a conversation that local public health would have about how best to protect the older people living within the communities that they were responsible for, right? So the way to protect older people in South Central LA is going to be very different than the way to protect older people in Ghent, Belgium, where I currently am. And it's not like 3 fringe epidemiologists are not going to have the universal knowledge to know how to do that. The goal was to orient public health toward protection of older people, and then have public health come up with specific ideas for their own communities where they live, or how best to do it. It'll be a very different way to protect older people that live in nursing homes than, for instance, that live in multi-generational homes with multiple other people, or live by themselves alone. You're going to have very different ideas. You're going to need very different ideas. And of course, the resources of every single place were different. And the idea was to use whatever resources were there as rapidly as possible so that focused protection could occur. It wasn't that it wasn't a 1,000-page report, Anders. It was a single-page document, a philosophical approach to how to manage the pandemic, not a cookbook.
I know. I read it. It's I think it's very good. It's excellent, actually, especially in hindsight. And I'll put a link in the description to those who haven't already found it. Talking about hindsight, now we're 2.5 years later into the future from the point of the Great Barrington Declaration. So what would you say, how should leaders have acted to handle the pandemic in the best way? Do you think that, for instance, Sweden, the place where I live, walked the right path, because Sweden handled things a bit differently than compared to other countries?
I think the Swedish approach was the best approach in the world. Now, I do have criticism of the Swedish approach. So, for instance, I think very early on in the pandemic, the Stockholm nursing homes faced a disaster.
Yeah.
And it had to do with lack of focused protection, right? The older people were exposed to the virus based on decisions that the Stockholm nursing homes made. And I think that led to the perception that Sweden had failed very early on in the pandemic, which is quite unfortunate. But very broadly speaking, the Swedish approach was developing resources, providing resources for older people that needed them to protect themselves, providing guidance. I mean, I know there were mass gathering limitations, but there were recommendations. Recommendations about where masking may or may not be appropriate, or most important. The most important thing was the tone of communication between the public and public health in Sweden was exactly the right approach. It was professional. It was aimed at producing calm rather than panic. It was aimed at providing accurate information about the disease spread when it was happening. It conveyed uncertainty about the efficacy of the recommendations appropriately, and generally built trust between public health and the public. That is the most important thing that Sweden did right. Maintain trust by not lying to the public. There was no noble lie.
So how do you think the world would have fared if every country had acted that way?
I think not every country would have had exactly Sweden's response. I mean, of course, the Swedish public and public health have a history that's actually quite good with each other. But I think the results would have been vastly better in terms of not imposing the policies that ended up harming people. Like, why did schools close for so long in so many places, harming children for nothing? Didn't actually produce any epidemiological benefit. That would not have happened had we followed the Swedish approach. I think Sweden never closed schools for kids under 16.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, which is a remarkable thing. And there was a study by Ludvigsen in Sweden, forgetting his first name, in the New England Journal of Medicine, that studied this and found that the teachers in those schools had lower COVID rates from spring of 2020 than the average of other workers in the population. I wish every country on Earth.
How's that possible? I mean, because they were in an environment where people didn't spread the virus?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think kids are not super spreaders. There's some Icelandic data that suggested this very early on, that it's not like other viruses. It's not like the flu, where kids do spread it more.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that was that was the main reason why schools were closed, because they thought that these kids would spread it to older people, to vulnerable people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's weirdly enough, it was protective to be around children. There were very interesting studies about like parents with young children compared to other adults of the same age. The parents with young children had better results with COVID than the matched people of the same age without kids, or preschool teachers. Kids somehow inoculated parents and adults that were around them, lucky enough to be around them.
Well, there were so many studies. I kind of remember that there were some studies like that. Now that you say it, I had forgotten. Fascinating stuff. So why do you think that politicians in so many countries were so eager to, like throw you mentioned that the GBD actually follows the old pandemic preparedness plans that were in place for decades. But why do you think they were so quick to throw these plans out the window in March of 2020? Was it because of China, or was it because it's kind of incomprehensible? It happened very quickly. I mean, the UK tried to follow Sweden for a couple of weeks, but then they kind of turned around as well very quickly and followed the USA and others.
Yeah. So if you look at the history of this, you'll see, for instance, epidemiologists writing op-eds in early March 2020 that sound an awful lot like the Great Barrington Declaration. Prominent epidemiologists who later became firm lockdowners. There's a report, I think there was a pivotal report from the World Health Organization mission to China in late February 2020, and it came that they sent some Western officials and a whole bunch of Chinese, met with a whole bunch of Chinese officials in China to evaluate the Chinese response to COVID in January of 2020. And they concluded that what China did worked, that the draconian lockdown that China imposed on Hubei province and on Wuhan had conquered the disease. And they recommended that other countries emulate China, including school closures, including all of the crazy lockdown policies. So the World Health Organization, I think, played a pivotal role in spreading the Chinese model of disease containment here. And then the contrast, of course, in February 2020 with Italy, which looked like an utter failure. Huge numbers of people dying, coffins lined up in cathedrals, overwhelmed hospital systems. And so I think that those two things, the Chinese response and the World Health Organization endorsing it, along with the Italian failure to manage COVID in 2020, early 2020, I think those two things led the world to copy each other. And for like politicians, I mean, it's really difficult to resist, right? You have some scientists telling you if you don't do this, millions of people are going to die. Well, I mean, imagine, Andrews, being in that position.
So I mean, some scientists, but not all, as you have pointed out many times.
Well, I mean, all the fringe scientists were suppressed, right? You weren't allowed to say anything
at that time as well.
Yeah, it was really tough. So I ran a seroprevalence study in April of 2020, in which found essentially a 2 in 1,000 death rate from in the non-institutionalized population in Santa Clara County, and then 50 times more infections than cases. That study got suppressed. I mean, I was violently. I mean, I was attacked viciously. I had death threats. I mean, it was my university went after me for doing the study. I mean, there was a lot of pressure to maximize, to like not say, you know, the kinds of things I'm currently saying, even as early as April of 2020, March of 2020.
Do you think there's a power itch, if you will, among leaders and politicians? Because the knee-jerk reaction seems to be pretty similar when it comes to the case of the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, the terrorism crisis. I mean, crisis is kind of it's gefundenes Fressen, as the Germans say. It's like perfect for leaders to be able to control people. I mean, this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I mean, is there something to it? Maybe.
So John Tierney, who's a journalist, wrote this fantastically interesting thing called he called it the crisis crisis.
Mm-hmm.
It's a crisis of crises. I think I don't know if it's. I think it's almost irresistible, right? So like I don't know that they necessarily love having a crisis, but a lot of leaders view crises as opportunities to consolidate, political power or whatnot. And, there's very famously, I think an advisor to President Obama said, you should never let a crisis go to waste.
Right? Because I mean, of course, you can. It's an excellent opportunity to show that you're doing something, especially in rich, mature countries like most of the Western countries, where nothing dramatic almost ever happens. So all of a sudden, there is something happening where I can show that I'm a fantastic leader.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, I think that dynamic definitely played itself out. I mean, like for instance, Andrew Cuomo would go on TV during the pandemic, showing he was the governor of New York, and show strong leadership at crushing the curve, and he won an Emmy award for his like press conferences. I mean, it's just a remarkable thing. I suppose that's irresistible. But even leaving aside leaders like that or like showboating, I think the thing is, you have a scientist telling you, like, if you don't do this, millions of people are going to die. It's very hard for a politician to resist that. Right? They don't generally have the tools, and they at that point that the opposing scientists just weren't sitting in front of them. So they could say, well, look, you're just go argue with this other nerd. I mean, that would have been one thing, but there wasn't another nerd in the room. And so the politicians just did a calculation. Well, if I follow what everyone else is doing, I won't get blamed. And if I buck the trend, I might get I might get accused of killing a vast number of people or letting a lot of my people die. I mean, I think so. That's why like leaders like Anders Tegnell impressed me so much, or Governor DeSantis impressed me so much. I mean, they basically said, "Look, I'm going to take this risk because I don't think it's the right thing to do to lock down, to close schools, to do all these things. Instead, we should just do what we know has worked in the past." But that at that point was a tremendously courageous act.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. So let's look a little bit at what's happening now, and then look into the future, and to the extent that we can do that. We talked before the interview a little bit about these excess deaths that are continuing to happen in many countries, in many Western countries, despite the fact that the pandemic is basically over. So people are not dying from COVID at an accelerated rate here, but from something else. So what are your thoughts on that? The fact that there are continuous excess, that there is a continuous excess mortality in many countries now, and what are your theories about what this can be?
I mean, I think Sweden is the most important place to look if you want to understand that, right? Sweden did not follow a lockdown policy; followed more like a focused protection policy, and it has among the lowest excess death rates in the world, and which is striking, right? So what that means then is that that the first order hypothesis is that it's the extended lockdown harms that are causing the excess deaths elsewhere. Right. So, for instance, the rates of depression and suicidality and drug abuse are through the roof in the United States and in Canada. The delay of people getting treatment for or screening for cancer has led to a big increase in later stage cancer rates. There's a big increase in untreated diabetes that has some consequences. Heart disease management. I think a lot of these are like extended lockdown harms. Now, I haven't seen a careful study that does a decomposition of all of this, but that's my primary hypothesis. Two other hypotheses. One is that, of course, COVID is still here, of course, and it's still causing damage and harm, especially, again, still to older people. That could be partly responsible. And then the third hypothesis is side effects from the vaccine, right? That's also, I think, a possibility. It's less likely because I think Sweden was pretty, they had a very high vaccination rate, and yet
I think it's about 85% or something.
Yeah. So, but again, it's possible, especially I think in younger people, there is evidence that you have, especially young men, high rates of myocarditis with the vaccines and so on. So, like countries that forced their young men to get vaccinated with and boosted 2 or 3 times, you could imagine that could play some role. But I think the primary hypothesis that I believe at this point is the extended lockdown harms.
And so this means that people who are dying now, the excess deaths now, are people who are younger than the ones who died from COVID, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing excess deaths in younger populations.
Have there been any studies about showing loss of life years as opposed to loss of lives in general? Because I mean, it's a bit controversial, but if you look at it that way, how many potential life years have been lost due to the pandemic? And I mean, then you would come to probably pretty different conclusions and different figures than what you see now when you just see numbers of dead people. I mean, people who would die a year from now or 2 years from now, but die this year instead. If you see my point.
No, I see. I think you're exactly right. A death of an older person means a loss of, let's say in their 80s, means a loss of 1 or 2 life years. Their death has moved forward by a year or 2, whereas a death of a 30-year-old, their death has moved forward by 50 years. I mean, those have some of those. I mean, both are tragic, but they do have a different valence, I think. I think the lockdown harms do not have that age skew that COVID deaths have. In fact, if anything, they're hurting young people more. And in some philosophical systems, that's worse because you're taking away more life years. If you look at the life expectancy of the United States, it hasn't. I expected it to pop back up after the pandemic, after COVID sort of worked its way through the population, and it hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas I think Sweden's life expectancy is
it's back actually to the expected level. I think already in 2021 was back to the level that you would expect.
It's entirely consistent with what you're saying, Anders. Or it's entirely consistent, right? So the lockdown arms hurt young people more, kill young people more, and these like excess deaths that we're seeing continuing into 2023. We have to. It's a multifaceted thing. It's very difficult to address, but I think if you want want to take this seriously, you have to try to understand how to address drug abuse caused by depression, which was initiated by the isolation of the pandemic. You have to address a screening of cancer again. You have to address immunization of children, which actually took a hit during the pandemic because a lot of people lost trust in public health. Immunization meaning of MMR, DPT, other standard immunizations. A lot of these basic public health kinds of things were neglected, and now we're in a situation where we have to catch up. And I don't see public health taking it seriously enough.
There seems to be forces who want to hand over more power to the WHO, the United Nations, in order for that body to have more clout the next time a pandemic strikes, and so that we can have a concerted effort, global effort to beat the next pandemic. Do you think that's? Then take away powers from individual nation states and place it and pool it in the WHO instead, to have a kind of a global health policy. Do you think that's a good idea? And do you think it's going to happen?
I think they want to make sure Sweden never happens again.
Okay.
I think it's a terrible idea. I think it'd be one thing if the WHO had earned the trust of the public during the pandemic. But I think the WHO, its advice decimated the economies and health status of poor countries. They recommended school closures to poor countries that now have a lost generation of children who missed 2 years of school or more, many of whom never came back to school. The WHO's approach during the pandemic, to my mind, shouldn't engender trust. And so why would you entrust them with the next pandemic with more power? I think the other thing about the WHO, it's so obviously they have their approach is so clearly manipulable to politics, right? So I think a third of the fund, a very large fraction of the funding of the WHO comes from the Gates Foundation, which had a very particular way that they wanted to manage the pandemic. Mm-hmm. They were very solicitous with the Chinese authorities, which played a tremendously important role in the thinking of the WHO and the recommendations of the WHO. Why would we want to entrust an organization that has particular partisan interest? It seems like partisan interest in mind, and hand over the sovereignty over critical things like public health. Every country ought to have its own say in it. And thank God for Sweden, right? If you allow the WHO to have the power it wants, you won't get Sweden a second time.
Mm. That's true. So what has the world learned from the pandemic, and what have you learned from the pandemic?
Well, unfortunately, I think that if we do have another pandemic, we will do the lockdowns again. The World Health Organization and major countries have not repudiated the lockdowns, so I think in a sense the world has learned nothing from the pandemic. Much of the authorities of the world that recommended the lockdowns are giving themselves awards, pretending like they succeeded when in fact it was a colossal failure. I don't think that I'm hopeful that won't last. that as the political winds change, people will have actually an honest look at the failures of the pandemic, and then reform our public health systems. The public health systems are very, very important for the health of the public. It's very important that public trust that you have a public health worthy of trust by the public. So I think that eventually will happen, but not in the immediate future. That doesn't seem, the prospects don't seem good. What have I learned during the pandemic? If you look back at my 3 years ago, I was so naive, Anders. I thought that science, if you do good science, people will listen to it, and then based on that, the world will get better. I think it takes more than that. You do have to have good science. That's critically important. But that good science needs to be put in front of the public, even when there are headwinds against that. And the scientific establishment, which I thought would embrace debate and discussion and logic and data, instead it used its power to suppress large parts of the scientific community from thoughts. The most power, there's a hierarchy within science that I didn't appreciate so much before. And like you have people like Francis Collins of the NIH calling me and Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta fringe epidemiologists. It's an abuse of power, right? So people like that at the top of the scientific hierarchies should not be using their power to suppress scientific discussion and debate and to delegitimize people who have legitimate points to make. I didn't fully understand how important these kinds of cartels were before the pandemic within scientific communities, and the danger that they pose. So, in a way, I'm no longer that naive as I once was 3 years ago.
A little bit of a gloomy note to end on, but sobering and interesting and fascinating and good to know these things, I guess.
Well, you have to first name the problem before you can start to fix them. I don't mean to depress the audience. I think these are fixable things, but you have to systematically know what they are before you can start to try to fix them.
Jay, it's been superb talking to you. I appreciate your time so much, and good luck with the lawsuit and with all your endeavors to have a sensible health policy.
Thank you, Andrew. So it was a great pleasure to talk to you as well.